Fresh green garden peas are one of the more memorable tastes of summer, and you don't need a garden to grow them in. The method I'm showing you can either be used on the vegetable patch or in containers. It's a method that's as old as the hills. The Victorians used to grow them in wooden V-shaped troughs, but it's been adapted now and we use short lengths of plastic guttering. It proves to be the perfect width and the perfect depth for starting them off. And what I'm doing here is just blocking the ends of the gutter itself just to stop the soil from collapsing and getting washed out. And I keep them in about 60 centimetre lengths. It's easier to handle. If you have a row across the garden, then I find it's easier to cut up several sections into short lengths. I find it easier to handle than trying to sort of maneuver a long flexible section. Filling the gutter is straightforward enough. I use regular potting compost, general purpose compost. Make sure it's new. I don't like to recycle old stuff just in case it harbours pests and diseases. And just pat it in layers. Make sure that it's firm at the bottom and doesn't move around too much. And just spread. And one thing you need to do is just make sure that the ends, you make it almost like a little dam, as I mentioned before. You just press it against that. But don't overfill them, I say, rather, because peas like soft ground, so make sure this rather not over loose, if we can use that term, but it's not so too heavily compacted that the seed is sitting in a wet medium and rots off. Just gently level it across the top using a presser and just strike it off. And I say, I'm trying hard not to overpress it and drag it out. You need a nice flat even surface so that all the peas are in at roughly the same depth, and then you get good even germination. The compost needs to be slightly damp when it comes to making the hole so that the compost holds together. If you feel yours is slightly dry, then just spray it over, give it a light misting just to hold it together. And you can see I'm doing them in a Quinn Cook's fashion, so it's sort of 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1. And this is the way that I would sow them in the open ground. And you get maximum sort of space and light and air for each plant then. Try to finish, if you can, on a double. It doesn't always work out, but I find that these 60 centimetre lengths allow you to do this. And then you're ready to go. And the ferrule on the pencil gives us the right depths. Now, always use fresh seed. It gives you fast germination. As I say, this is what you want whenever you're doing any job. You don't want any hanging about waiting for plants to catch up. I'm sowing a snap pea here, Nairobi. It's a bush, a tallish bush, about 60 centimetres tall, so it's not going to grow too big to be unstable if you're going to grow it in the container. And as I say, you're guaranteed a crop because you eat the entire pod, which will come out about 6 to 9 centimetres, 2 to 3 inches long. And you put one seed per hole. There's no need to worry about overdoing it. And as I say, because we're using fresh seed and we're almost guaranteed 100% germination. And just make sure that they're down at the bottom of the hole. There's no air space underneath, otherwise the plants will germinate in fresh air. And we just need to push them down, once again using our magic dibber with the ferrule on it. I think this is a couple just above the surface there, and they just need poking down. And then covering is fairly straightforward. Just use some loose compost over the surface, just gently work it in. You don't want to overpress it. Just cover the seeds. There's almost a sort of slightly stroking, smoothing action there, just to make sure that you don't want to roll the seed around in the compost itself. So we get back to the presser just to get that nice flat surface, and there's sufficient contact in that to make sure that the seeds will germinate. I don't water the seed at this stage because the compost usually coming out of the bag is sufficiently wet, and you may have noticed there's no drainage holes at the bottom of the gutter. This is because if the roots grow through, they just catch, and it makes the task of sliding them out a little bit more difficult. For a couple of weeks, you should have something like this. Now move on to the fun bit, which is actually transferring the peas from the guttering into the container or into the garden. And what I like to do is to use a spare piece of guttering as to act as a former. And you can see it here in the container. Same thing if you're making a trench in the soil. And what you need to do, and you just saw me doing, is water the sides of the tray to make sure that the compost stays in the shape, holds its shape, and then just loosen the soil by waggling it back and forth. And now we have to try and get the peas to slide out of the gutter in. Now it looks as if these are just a little bit too dry. I thought it was wet enough, but no. So what you have to do is just put them to one side and just slide some more water underneath the compost. It acts as a form of lubrication. And you don't want to overdo it, but you want to try and get the water underneath the compost, between the compost and the gutter, not from above. It takes a bit of patience, but you want to try and hold everything together. It isn't always as awkward as this. Eventually we will get there. And once you get it sliding slowly, don't hold it too high, just a couple of centimeters up above, and then once it begins to slide, as you can see here, it just goes straight out quite easily. The best method to use is to use your one hand as a stop to prevent the root ball from collapsing, and then just slowly and carefully slide the gutter from underneath, pull it back with the other hand, and then it just gently fall into the trench. It isn't as if you are launching a boat on the causeway. You don't want it sort of to slide off and splash into the water, but just be careful with it. And then all you need to do is to trickle some spare compost in around the edges just to make sure there are no air spaces or gaps around there. And really that is as much as you can do at this stage. And it's ready to go. You can see the tendrils are forming and it's ready to climb. So we put a little bit of support in later on. I've got to be honest, with dwarf peas, and this is dwarf Hearst green shaft, you don't really need a support system. But I find it's always best just to try and keep them vertical. It tidies them up. And the beauty of Hearst green shaft is it is 2 pods per branch with 10 peas per pod, so it's plenty of growing going on in the space there. And here you can see a sort of catch cradle over them, and what you could do if you were troubled by it is throw a net over them to keep the birds at bay. Diolch, and thank you for watching. Goodbye for now, but if you would like to see any more, please hit the subscribe and like buttons.